they go out and get a stay of execution. Basically a statute is passed, and then there's a period before it's put into law. So they'd hit the courts then, get a stay on the enforcement of the statute while the lawsuit's pending, and then get the case thrown out. I get the statute thrown out as being unconstitutional. And the essence of it is that basically these statutes are trying to treat video games different than films or books or magazines or anything else.
Could you explain for those of us who aren't lawyers or haven't gone to law school how that's categorically different from the restriction of sale of sexually explicit films to minors?
Well, no, I can't. Can you, Ross? You want to take that? I don't. Here's the point. Well, first of all, these aren't sexually explicit games. Okay, so there's not. They don't have. There are specific laws about pornography that apply to that, and there's a presumed harm in a person under a certain age viewing pornography. Okay, and the old Supreme Court, which justice was that? You should know that. You're in law school. Somebody from law school who said it's pornography. I know it when I see it.
You know it when you see it.
Yeah, was it black? Yeah, anyway, I mean, and actually that's true. And pornography is basically judged by a community standard. And if it's pornographic, the presumption is that it's bad for people. That same presumption has never been applied to violence.
And keep in mind, pornography is defined in the statutes independent of the medium that it's transmitted in. So, I mean, there's pornography laws that would apply to video games just as they would apply to films.
It's just sex versus violence. It's not video game versus film.
It's okay to kill people, but you can't show people having sex.
And on that note, but on that note, the Supreme Court has actually set a pretty high standard as to what level of violence is necessary for the government to be able to step in, and it's basically the level that you're actually physically inciting a riot at. Anything less than that, I mean, I don't know if any video game, aside from maybe a State of Emergency, that old Rockstar game, that would come anywhere close to that.
I don't think I
wouldn't either.
I would say none of them will, but that's just me. And the other thing is these statutes are what's referred to as prior restraint, and that means you're asking to put a restriction on speech before it's sold. And the real issue there is that the Supreme Court U.S. law is very narrow as to when you can do a prior restraint. And so that's sort of like the standard that was applied. And it's surprising to me, considering all the states that these statutes were passed in, and all the crazy judges I've been in front of. Not crazy. There are all sorts of, judges are just like people. There's all sorts of them, and they all have all sorts of politics and internal dynamics. And federal judges have uniformly stricken down that statute, which I suppose leads us to the New York statute. I think one of the things is that I've seen a couple of these, and they all looked exactly the same. And it's kind of usually when someone has a political agenda that they want to implement through statutory implementation, what they'll do is, if it fails somewhere, they change it and try to adapt the statute to a different set of rules. And it was the same, pretty much the same statute over and over again. And I know from the information I had that the majority of these were basically being pushed out by Wacky Jackie.
Yeah, I mean, it's like COPA, the Child Online Protection Act. I mean, it's been stricken down. 2 or 3 different versions of it now have been stricken down.
Yeah, but they change it every time.
They change it every time, and it still keeps getting struck down. One of the interesting things, going to what Tom said about treating video games different from film, in the Schwarzenegger case, one of the fact issues that they looked at was whether there was any research basis to tie violent video games to proclivity for violent behavior or to cause violent behavior. And in that case, I mean, there was another dearth of it. There was none. There was no valid scientific research that proved any sort of causal connection between violent video games and violent behavior. So, I mean, I agree with Tom. I think that, to the extent that the film industry is largely self-regulated, the R-rated movies versus PG-13 versus PG. So I think my own personal belief is that the video game industry, and it's gotten a lot better at self-regulation, but there's still some ways to go on that. But I think self-regulation is a better answer than new laws.
And it's an issue of fairness. I mean, nobody at all is disputing that games are speech, and obviously no one would dispute that movies are speech. But there's an inequity in how these things are enforced, and that nobody is trying to criminalize movies and violent movie content in anywhere near the same way that they're trying to do it with games. I mean, if Grindhouse were a game, it would be horrifying the anti-violent advocacy groups, and so it really becomes an issue of fairness. And that actually kind of leads into the next question I wanted to bring before the panel is there a morality issue that follows the legal issue? Is there any room for morals within the law in this industry? Is there a moral obligation to be protecting minor gamers here?
You want my opinion? That's not a job for the law.
Yeah, I was saying, I'm an attorney, I'm not touching morality.
You don't know who you're talking to.
Yeah.
Morals? Actually, on the IGDA board, we take, we've got a dozen people, and we sort of discuss what position the organization should take on this. And there are developers, and more than a few that I know, who basically think that violent video games are bad and that they send a bad message. They communicate that they do have a negative impact on the developmental growth of young people. I'm not one of them. I mean, my kid was playing Quake with me I was playing Quake with a friend of mine's son when he was 4 years old online. And the kid's 14 now or 15, and he's
Kicks a few puppies on his way to school.
No, he's actually a real. I mean, I've met him, and I still know him. He's still in the clan, and he's a good, solid kid. My son, on the other hand, is a different story. But no, he's a developer now, so But I don't. I think there's an interesting statistic that I have to stick in here, and that is, FBI crime statistics for people in the target demographic who play violent games show that violent crimes in that group has actually decreased over the last 8 years. So I would suggest that there may be a correlation there, and I've talked to several researchers about doing some actual research on that. Because there's a certain level of acting out that happens in violent games. I know myself, I was a trial attorney and needed to have that combat until I started playing violent video games, and all of a sudden I had an outlet for that need for that visceral contact that I needed to have, and it actually allowed me to move into a more transactional practice. So, I'm a test case, or a nutcase. But I do think, I have to agree with Ross. You want to talk about morals, I think you got the wrong panel, I'm sorry.
No, that's actually kind of the answer I was going for. So how about we open the floor to questions on the subject of legislation and violent content this time. There's a microphone right there that should be on.
Yeah, I think they want to record the questions.
Isn't going after video games sort of like an easy pick for legislators? It appeals to older voters, and the older legislators as well. They don't really they aren't the target demographic for most video games. I think the average gamer age is 33, whereas steady voters, especially in state elections, are much, much older. Doesn't it sort of make an easy target I'm sure movies did back when they were first introduced?
Rock and roll.
New art styles, rock and roll, new music styles. Do you think this is just a phase, the legislation, the anti-video game, anti-violence, and that's going to go away as our demographic gets older?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I can't disagree with that. There's always, legislation of the day or the hot issue going on. Up until 2 years ago, no one cared about, well, I shouldn't say no one, but, up until a few years ago, not as many people cared about being green as they do today. It's all, there's social implications, and there's new technologies that come about. Just that as much as video games have been a topic of the day, everyone, and it's subsided a little bit, but peer-to-peer file sharing networks, they were the hot topic for a day, but, the lawsuits took care of that, and it turned out no new legislation was needed, at least from the legislative standpoint. So I think video games are going to be somewhat similar in that anytime there's a new technology, there's, a period of lag that it takes. Well, one, it takes courts a while to learn the technology and understand the technology,